Happy Tuesday, everyone. Welcome to our fortnightly political Geekfest and a special pre-budget one today. It used to be the most exciting day of the year on the calendar, and Budget Day was the day that all the tribes converged on Canberra to pour over a bunch of tables that very few people actually understood. And it's been put back about 6 months, but the day is upon us, Katharine. How are you?
It is.
I'll do the intros in a sec, but how are you feeling? Is it as exciting as normal, or is it just a bit more weirdness?
No, it's a very strange budget, this one, because we're not being locked up as we generally are all together in the sort of main committee areas of the Parliament. So normally on Budget Day, there's, as Peter says, it's a great convergence of the tribes, both political, lobbying, journalistic. Everybody descends on the place. Our bosses come down from their head offices, and there's all kinds of pageantry that happens as we all sort of drift into the lockup. But none of that's happening this year. We're all being locked down in our offices in the press gallery in Canberra, and there are separate lockups for our bosses in Sydney and Melbourne, and some reporters and subs, obviously. So it's incredibly quiet. I came in this morning at 8 o'clock, and normally the place is absolutely heaving on Budget Day by 8 o'clock. I wandered up the corridors. I didn't see another person. It's sort of pin drop quiet. It's a very, very unusual budget.
Okay, well, I bet before we go any deeper, I better just do our formalities, which of course is recognising that all of us around the country are on Indigenous land. I am on the land of the Gadigal people, the Eora Nation, and I pay respects to elders past, present, emerging, recognising the land we're all on was never ceded. I also welcome the 100+ people who have joined us in this town hall today to kick over the essential report. I don't think many of you need to be told the rules. Put your chat on, put your camera on, contribute to the discussion, ask questions and keep it nice. It's pretty easy. Asking questions and keeping it nice has kind of also been the way that I think we've been looking at this budget up till now, with an expectation that this won't be a normal budget that's totally framed around, I guess, the bookkeeping side of it, that there might be embedded a bit of a vision for the future of the country. But what's your gut telling you about today based on the leaks and, what could come next, Katharine?
Yeah, it's sort of weird because at one level, the government's telling us that this is the most important budget since the Second World War. And while that, might be slightly hyperbolic, there's certain truth to that. Obviously, we are in really, really difficult and challenging times. So at one level, that's the framing. At another level, the Treasurer says this budget is squarely about the here and now, which is part of expectations management to this extent. I think there'd be a lot of fellow travellers with the government who would want this budget to be a real reform roadmap, for want of a better term, that they would want to see a sort of return to supply side economics. So, the sort of all of the kind of policy wish lists of the centre right in Australia for the last 30 years, they would want to be sort of mapped out in this budget. And I think ahead of time, by saying this budget's about the here and now, the Treasurer is sort of saying to people, to the Coalition's base and fellow travellers, look guys, this is going to be a Keynesian budget. We've got to spend a fair bit of money trying to keep people employed. We're going to give people tax cuts. There'll be a certain amount of glancing at the future in terms of what that should be and look like. But the budget will be a sort of heavy lifting job for what needs to happen according to their way of seeing things to stimulate the economy here and now. So, we'll see, obviously, in a couple of hours when they unveil the lot, whether what balance the government strikes between those two imperatives, framing the future and dealing with the here and now. But I think from the early framing, it seems to be focused on how to basically support demand in the economy now, according to liberal ways of doing things. And liberal ways of doing things are obviously giving people tax cuts, giving businesses concessions to hire people and invest. You know, this is very much, even though, put it this way, Peter, like it is quite a leap, really, when you think the last budget that I covered was the Back in Black budget. The Treasurer stood up at the dispatch box in May 2019 and said, you know, we are back in black, and Australia is back on track. They were the opening lines of his budget statement just over a year ago. Now we're going to see one of the biggest deficits on record and $1 trillion debt. And that turnaround in circumstances, I think, would sort of create the impression that there's a full kind of paid up conversion to Keynesianism on the part of the Liberal Party. But I suspect that's not really the case, that it's horses for courses, that a very pragmatic Prime Minister and Treasurer are doing what they think needs doing now. And I think after the budget, we'll see a debate about the efficacy of the measures. You know, is now the time to be giving people tax cuts? Is now the time to be relying on businesses to employ staff when we are not yet through a pandemic, when we do not have at this time a vaccine? Although, I mean, Donald Trump's sort of amazing pathway out of the Walter Reed Hospital to the balcony at the White House may encourage people to believe that there might be some effective therapies, perhaps, for people, keeping people upright. But
if you pump enough stuff into you, which might be also an economic theory, I don't know.
I don't know, exactly. Might be a metaphor for Keynesianism, I don't know. But
on Keynesianism, can I just, is this real? I always thought Keynesianism was about investing and creating jobs. And it seems that while we're using the language of Keynesianism because we're running big deficits, like, I don't think giving people a tax cut is necessarily pure Keynesian. And I thought the real interesting reveal over the last few months was when Frydenberg started invoking Reaganism as opposed to, and of course, Reagan spent a lot of taxpayer money, getting rid of tax for wealthy people and business. And I've done a piece up on The Guardian today that sort of looks at that in the context of Kurt Anderson's fantastic new book, Evil Geniuses, and the long project to wind back the state and basically individualise economic theory. And it seems to me that we might be giving the government almost a tick mark that it doesn't quite deserve when we call it they're doing Keynesian. What do you reckon?
Well, a column I wrote last Saturday, my weekend column last week, posed the question whether the government would be crisis Keynesians and recovery Reaganites, right? It's the obvious question to ask. I think some of the fiscal, expansionary fiscal policy we've seen during the crisis does kind of fit the mode of Keynesianism, as in the income support and other measures to try and stimulate demand. Aggregate demand is a sort of key concept of Keynesianism. But at some point, there's going to be a transition into, I think that was what I was trying to flag a minute ago, into some of the sort of centre-right wish list kind of set of propositions, right? And this government might be a slight bridge to that, in the sense that I think that the primary debate that will basically happen tonight after the budget is in the public domain and over the next few days is whether or not these particular measures, handing people tax cuts and other things, are the right strategies, sort of demand-enhancing strategies at this point in time, whether or not, more direct government spending and interventions may have been a better strategy given where we stand. So, I think they're sort of tracking in a Reaganite direction, but we may not see sort of full Reagan this evening.
I guess the other really interesting thing is that in terms, and I think we spoke about this a couple of weeks ago with Paul in your absence, was that to date, we've almost been living a politics where everything's been thrust upon the government. There's been no alternatives. It feels like tonight is the moment where the government is being forced to now make some choices and to say, we're going to do this, but we're not going to do that.
Yeah.
We're putting money into first home buyers. We're not going to build social housing. We're giving people tax cuts. We're not going to keep JobSeeker where it was before. So it does create the moment where I think the political battle re-engages, because now those choices have consequences.
Yeah, well, again, I think in the column I wrote last weekend, I noted that the Prime Minister, if he could do it, if he had the capacity to do it, would outrun his own legacy. He's a Prime Minister that doesn't like characterisation or typecasting. He likes to be whatever the moment requires him to be. But the thing about being a Prime Minister is that a Prime Ministership, a government, is the accumulation of hundreds, thousands of decisions that create a legacy. As you say, the government makes choices. The government decides to give someone a tax cut rather than do something else. And that, that creates an identity. It creates a legacy. Prime Ministers literally write themselves into history by what they do. So I think you're right. We've sort of seen this creeping return of the political contest, I think, over the last couple of months, both in Morrison's kind of the deterioration of the relationship between the Commonwealth and the states through the National Cabinet, which is a sort of return of partisanship within the Commonwealth. And I think Labor's pretty determined this week to do two things. One, use the sort of gravitational forces of the Parliament to force a more normal intraday political conversation, sort of cut and thrust, backwards and forwards. So, a sort of accountability dynamic, but I think Labor also wants to start to put some flesh on the bones of what sort of alternative government it might be in the event that it can win the next election.
If you're Labor, what are you hoping to see tonight in the budget?
You're hoping to see a colossal error, aren't you? You're hoping to see some sort of fatal misjudgment in terms of the politics. I think the government's made based on what we've all been told in terms of the pre-briefing, the government, for as long as possible, kept the idea out there that it would bring forward both the stage 2 and stage 3 tax cuts in this budget tonight. That was left out there for the longest possible time. They only really yanked that back in the last 24 hours and were basically briefing that, no, we'll do stage 2, but we won't do stage 3. Stage 3 will sit as legislated. Now, it would have been a risky call, I think, politically, to bring forward the stage 3 tax cuts, given they are so directed at high income earners. That would have given Labor an obvious, you're all kind of reborn Thatcherites and Reaganites stick with which to beat the government with. And it would have tied up also the budget package in some sort of protracted political or parliamentary arm wrestle. So the government's elected not to do that, which suggests that it wants to sort of minimise the extent to which it will be portrayed as in any way drifting back to that sort of more ideological kind of projection of itself, for want of a better term, right? So they've pulled that back. But I think Labor will just be hoping, that there's a bunch of choices here that are vulnerable to scrutiny. And if scrutiny can be applied with more force in a more normal dynamic, then they can get themselves back into the contest.
Indeed. We premised a few of our questions on the assumption that stage 3 was going forward today. And we'll jump into the numbers in a sec, but I think it's interesting just to have a general chat before we get there today. Although I think it's a double-edged sword, because the way it's set up, so if they fast track the stage 3, yes, there's a really easy rhetorical point now.
Yeah.
But the alternate is that if they stick to the current timetable, it becomes an issue that Labor can take to the next election.
Oh, yeah,
Tax cuts to the rich. So I'm not quite sure which. I don't think either of them really work politically for the government. But they seem determined to flatten the tax rate, and that seems to be, part of what they see as their historical mission. And I guess the real question is, as we get to understand how deep this recession is going to go, whether that's still a sustainable strategy. Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's right. This is the thing, the sort of, this is the fault line, I guess, Labor can run along if it's inclined to do so, that the times require bigger governments, right? That one of the reasons Australia got through the first run of the coronavirus better than some of the countries we routinely compare ourselves against was a government story. It was the fact that governments, when competent, are powerful, that they can inject themselves to literally save lives and livelihoods, which is what we saw. Sort of shrinking the government in the current environment is sort of consistent with the Liberal and National Party's kind of centre-right ideology, but is not necessarily consistent with what people want at this point in time. Look, there's certainly a fault line to run along, but I don't know to what extent Labor really wants to differentiate themselves from the government. I mean, really differentiate themselves. I think this will be an interesting week to sort of test that a bit because, there are some in Labor kind of, caught up with post-traumatic stress about the outcome of the last election. They're a big, obvious alternate to the government of the day, and they lost. There would be a school of thought within Labor to not run those risks, in such high visibility again. But you don't win the government. Yeah. You don't win government by sitting there being a small target.
But you also don't win elections running the previous campaign you wish you'd run, and that's kind of a recurring theme, I think, in Australian politics, isn't it?
Yeah, better bloody oath, yeah.
Hey, should we jump into a few figures and then we'll come back for a bit of a discussion, because I think I'm preempting some of the findings even as we're talking. And this, this gives us a little bit of a situation analysis maybe of the context of the of how the budget sits as the ink dries. So we're still concerned, not quite as we're not as very concerned as we were, but we're more quite concerned than we were. So we've gone from very to quite. We're still concerned. How much do you think what we watch, the reopening, in, like, on one level, for all its intents and purposes, this thing's under control everywhere but Melbourne, and fingers crossed Melbourne isn't far behind. Yeah. And, if anything else, Melbourne's now got access to their golf courses, which I think is just, fantastic. However, we are watching fresh outbreaks in Europe, the absolute implosion in the States. And I guess my sort of working assumption is the worse the rest of the world gets and we stay stable, the better it is for incumbent governments.
Well, yes, I think I certainly think it's true that the environment, if well managed, or the perception is that it's well managed, is benefits incumbents for sure. People tend to stick with who and what they know during times of really acute anxiety, and this is a time of really acute anxiety, notwithstanding the fact that there's a waxing and waning of anxiety, which we can see beautifully plotted in that graph there on that Peter's sharing. Right? We can see it's like a what's that thing that takes your heart rate? What's that called? An ECG or whatever it's called. It's sort of like
the machine that goes beep, I think is its technical term.
Yeah, the machine that goes beep, right? Like there it is, sort of plotted out beautifully on a graph, right? And the graph tells us we are anxious. At a time when we're anxious, we tend to stick with who and what we know, unless they're really screwing up massively. And I don't know that any government is screwing up massively. So in Australia, I mean, obviously elsewhere it's a different story. But anyway, yeah, it's a tough environment if you're a challenger. That's the short answer. Yeah.
Yeah. And, we return to the other flat line, which is government performance responding, still in the 60s. John, I'm assuming that the partisan breakdowns remain pretty much the same, that the very goods are coalition and the quite goods are everybody else. Is that still the case? There hasn't been any sort of mass conversion of Labor voters to the very good column, but nor so a massive departure saying that you're all absolutely hopeless either.
No, I'm afraid not. It's still sticking where we are. So we've got about 80% of coalition voters saying the government's doing a very 80% saying quite or very good, 37% very good. So they're still sticking by the man. It's down for Labour's. So it's only 13% of Labour voters rating the government as very good, and low for Greens 7% and 14 others. So yes, that very good is really concentrated amongst those partisan voters.
But I guess, Katharine, the other thing has been this decoupling of, approval of government performance and actual voting intention. And while we haven't been running the fortnightly scoreboard, next week will be a quarterly release of 2PP. So it'll be interesting to have a look in that rearview mirror at the track of voting intention against that. But what's really interesting, I think, is just the stability of that approval of government. And if we go to states, it's kind of similar as well. And even, I don't know what level of trauma our friends such as John in Melbourne are in now, but they're not totally walking away from a state government, even after what was a pretty torrid week for the Premier losing his health minister, having the quarantine inquiry, but it only knocked a couple of points off the positive rating of the performance of the government down there.
Yeah, well, it's, as you say, it has been stable. Obviously, the state governments, it's off the highs, right? Everybody is sort of off the highs, and Victoria is its own set of circumstances. And yeah, it has been torrid. And again, as usual, big shout out to all our friends in Melbourne who are tuning into this conversation. I'm so relieved that things are looking better down there, and hopefully the lockdown, hopefully everyone will get past the lockdown, right? So, but again, it's sort of like, it reinforces that earlier point that it's a good environment for incumbents. But there is, as you say, this decoupling between broad support and approval for leaders and voting intentions. So what that means, well, we won't really know what that means until the election cycle, until the political cycle gets to the game end, really, I think.
Well, where it is in Queensland at the moment.
Yeah.
And we've got some Queensland numbers at the tail end of this discussion. But yeah, I think there is government and there is politics, and as we've said, the really refreshing thing about this period has almost been the decoupling of that, and the really positive things that happen when you decouple government from politics, even if it's just in the midst of a crisis.
Yeah, absolutely.
So and for this year's federal budget. Who will it be good or bad for? So I don't know if everyone can look at the small print on this screen, but we sort of put a whole bunch of different interests, from big business to Australian families, people on lower incomes, younger Australians. The standout for me here, and a potential opportunity for the government to exceed expectations, is the pretty low number of people who see this as being good for them personally. If all of them get, a bit of a tax refund signed by the Prime Minister sent to them in the next couple of weeks, that'll be kind of overachieving, won't it?
Yeah. Well, I think it's that I think these numbers suggest that there has been a mini triumph of expectations management on the part of the government, for sure. I mean, it'll be interesting. Look, I mean, everyone wants a tax cut, right? Like, if someone offers you a tax cut, I don't really know anyone who'd say, no, nick off, I don't really need that tax cut, thanks. Even though people tell pollsters like you guys that they prefer services to tax cuts. It's kind of weird, right? But faced with your personally signed tax return from Scott Morrison, you're going to put it in your wallet. Or, well, actually, at the moment, the evidence suggests you're going to put it in the bank rather than anywhere else.
Yeah.
But anyway, that notwithstanding, yeah, it looks like a goodies budget in the sense of people will get stuff. There's some speculation that, as well as the tax cuts, there might be cash bonuses for pensioners and others in the budget when we get it the Savo. So if it sort of turns out to be a goodies budget, and most people think that, you know, the budget won't be any good for me, well, they'll be surprised on the upside, which they presumably will reward the government for doing. So, you know, the whole kind of insane dance, pre-budget dance, is just an extended exercise by the government in trying to set expectations, trying to basically sort of, it kind of builds to a crescendo of what people think is going to happen in the budget with all of the coverage. And then obviously the budget appears and people compare the before and after. Mm-hmm. And I think most governments would want to set up a proposition where they sort of undersold the goodies ahead of time, so that people were surprised on the upside and you know, hopefully did something nice for them, like vote for them.
Given where we are in the political cycle, do you think the main priority of this document is for it to be popular or to be effective? And I'm just sort of thinking on the run that it really has to work, doesn't it? And this is where I think there are risks, because as you've said, if the strategy is to put money in people's pocket, but that ends up sitting in the bank, that's not going to work. And all you're going to end up with is a need to cut back services down the track.
Well, this is the thing. It's sort of like, and it gets back to the legacy point that we were talking about a minute ago, Peter, that we sort of are at the stage of the government now where legacies get formed, where the sum of decisions do accumulate and stick to the incumbents, even though Morrison seriously is the most effective Prime Minister at that kind of, at that Teflon type, you know, I don't even know what you call it, a Teflon strategy, whatever you call it, I don't know. But he's the most effective I've seen at having things not stick. But the fact of the matter is gravity does assert itself. You do make a bunch of decisions as a government. You are accountable for those decisions, and the strategy will either work or not. That is the big question about the budget tonight. Will it work? It's the only question that matters fundamentally. And, you know, Australians are going to an election, well, probably, you know, in 12 months' time. So it's sort of, you know, it is, I mean, high stakes is a dreadful cliche, so I won't even invoke it, but it is consequential in that sense, right? This is like, you know, we've been through a crisis. The government's done a dramatic shape shift of its identity in full public view. It's become very pragmatic. Now it's setting up a bunch of propositions in a budget. They are highly contestable, these propositions. This roadmap for recovery is a very contestable roadmap. There are alternatives. And
in short, is the roadmap, am I oversimplified? The roadmap is to give people money so they will spend it, which will create jobs. Where the alternate thing would be to cut the giving people the money out of the equation and go straight to creating the jobs.
Yeah, well,
through caring economy, through...
Yeah, it's kind of like, you asked me a minute ago, like, what's the objective, effective or popular, right? Very good question. Although it sort of sets these things up in sort of competition
false
with
binary,
one another,
probably, yeah.
Right. Well, no, I don't think it's a false binary, Peter. I don't think it's a false binary, but I think it's sort of like, you know, the politicians' answer would want to be both effective and popular, right? And sometimes you can be effective and popular. God forbid. I mean,
but sometimes you can't be as well.
Well, that's right. No. That's exactly right. So I think it's sort of like getting back to this idea of, you know, the government shape shifting, that a year ago we were back in black. Now they're going to be the $1 trillion deficit people. You know, oh God, they've fundamentally changed their identity. Well, no, actually they haven't. Like the set of propositions that, you know, that will form the core, the spine of this budget are very, very much Liberal Party propositions, right? They will either work, they will either achieve the desired end, or they won't. And if they don't, and Australians are, you know, in a shaping up to be in a protracted downturn, which is entirely possible given where things are currently at, well, then that environment is much harder for governments, notwithstanding the fact that the environment as a general proposition does benefit incumbents, and Morrison is creating this rally around the flag effect in order to try and enhance the benefits of his own incumbency.
And, you know, I do think the government gets a leave pass for not delivering a surplus. Like, I think it would be churlish and unreasonable to say that you've failed because you are no longer delivering your promised surplus given what's happened. However, I'm curious at which point they will continue to get a leave pass if things don't work with this model. And I'm interested in your thoughts on when, is this the moment of accountability, or can they still kick this down the can? Morrison's strength has been to continually be a leader of the opposition in power, so that he's been able to defer and deflect. And in a way, the pandemic is potentially a great deferral and deflection for personal responsibility. But, you know, there is a philosophy through this budget, isn't there? And it's one that there has to, I guess the challenge for Labor is to build the accountability framework for it if it doesn't work.
Yeah, well, that's right. And it's not something you do in 5 minutes, building an accountability framework with a government that, you know, as you say, sets itself up through a number of different mechanisms to not really engage with that accountability framework. So it's, you know, it's something that you have to build up over time. And also the passage of time is important in terms of the test, right? Does it work or not? Nothing's going to work in 5 minutes. This is all going to play out over months. So I suppose, you know, the government has got to be given the opportunity to allow its various prescriptions to work. In the event that they don't work, then the flip side of that is that the government is accountable for those decisions.
I'm just flipping a few slides just because I wanted to get to this one, which in terms of telling the big story, I thought was really interesting. And I accept in many ways we've sort of thrown out a bit of a forced choice where you've got to jump in one or the other, but I do think it talks to that crossroads idea. So in this poll, we gave people a binary choice. One is the pandemic has exposed flaws in the economy and there is an opportunity to explore new ways to run the economy. And now is not the time to experiment with new ideas. We should return to the way the economy was being run. And overwhelmingly, people accept the former proposition, not the second. So I do think if the Liberals if Labor can succeed in boxing the coalition into that second proposition that this is just the old way, and then that doesn't work, that becomes the pathway to opening up something that Labor can at least work with. And there's a whole bunch of new way ideas out there, and of course they get to choose what those new ways are, and it can't be modern monetary theory, or they're in all sorts of strife. But it's interesting, isn't it? That's an overwhelming number.
Yeah, well, it sort of goes back to this idea that people have relearned or have experienced something they haven't experienced probably for more than a decade, which is a positive sensation of a government being present in their lives. Right, and from that foundation comes, whether or not the economic thinking that existed in terms of in a policy sense, whether the economic thinking that sort of dominated the run up to the global financial crisis is fit for purpose in the current environment. Like, you know, the thing that we're really not even touching on in Australia at the moment, and there's a very, very, robust debate in countries that actually went into recession after the GFC, unlike us, right? There's a very robust debate around the world about whether the sort of conventional economic policies that have persisted over the last sort of several decades are actually fit for purpose in the current environment. We've entered this sustained period of paltry economic growth. You know, there's not a lot of room left in monetary policy to do anything at all. So it's sort of like, obviously we have had a bit of an MMT debate in Australia over the past few months, but that's, you know, that is like the debate's a lot broader than that. So,
well, that's just an excuse to open up money, which the government seems to be doing anyway. I guess debate is around what is the pathway back and whether a long-term negative debt is this glittering public policy objective, or if it takes precedence over other objectives if it leaves the polity weaker.
Yeah.
But my question on this is, if you're the coalition and you see those numbers, would there have been the temptation, given that there are no constraints really on how much you spend this cycle anyway, to have gone, bugger it, we will put money into the social housing, the early learning, and some of the sort of the bigger picture spends that have been advocated by the other side of politics, and just sort of locked in that centralist. But they I don't know if they've resisted that temptation or just opted not to go down that path.
Well, I think it's just like it takes a lot for the Liberal and National parties to conceptualise themselves as a big government party. You know, fundamentally, they conceptualise themselves and their political philosophy as a smaller government party. So, you know, they return to their sort of core statements of belief, which is, you know, we are always the party of lower taxes. We are always, you know, the party of business incentives, right? And it's sort of within, it's kind of experimentation within a curve. Obviously, they are very extended fiscally. They are running they're running a very expansionist fiscal policy because the times require it. But in terms of wiring up how that goes on in perpetuity, what you do in the short and medium terms, we're kind of back to these sort of central principles of Liberal and national governments, which is, you know, if we can give you a tax cut, we will. If we can give business concessions, then we'll do that too. So that's sort of where we're at, I think. But then I guess there's a question about how that develops from here, and that's not entirely obvious. How, you know, once we deal, to sort of go back to the Treasurer saying the budget's about the here and now. You know, tonight we'll see a prescription for the here and now in terms of how, you know, how their version of a stimulus works, right? But I don't know necessarily that this budget will answer the long-term question about, you know, how they really want to position the country for recovery over the long haul. Because, you know, one thing history tells us is that we no longer live in an environment where recessions are followed by a snap back to normalcy. Like that did not happen after the global financial crisis anywhere. Didn't happen anywhere. Even in Australia, where we avoided recession, we had a long sustained period of low growth. We are in a different set of conditions. So how the government faces up to those different conditions, well, again, we'll learn a bit tonight, but I'm not sure the story is fully resolved yet.
One last slide before we come up for air. Another kind of dual proposition, best way to create jobs. Government should directly invest in the economy by creating projects and jobs. 69%. Government should relax regulation, lower taxes. Now, the for the wealthy maybe distorts this proposition, given that may not be the main organising principle of the cuts, we'll see. But the broader thing of relaxing regulation, lower taxing, kind of the Friedmanite agenda, just 19%. So again, you can see if it was possible to turn this into a broader contest of ideas, there seems to be something there for a Labor opposition to use.
Oh well, I think there is. I think there is there is genuine space for an alternate set of ideas to be prosecuted, and I hope that another set of ideas will be prosecuted, because regardless of where you line up in that sort of battle of ideas, if you're a small government or a big government person, I mean, that debate should be had. So, I hope it's not just sort of some anemic, Me Tooism that emerges as a consequence of all of this. I hope we do see a robust battle of ideas, because the times really demand one.
I'm going to see if a man who knows a little bit about putting budgets out, Michael Kearney, wants to come on, and he made a really interesting comment in the chat. Michael, if you're there, you're welcome. Otherwise, I'll read it on your behalf. You there, Michael?
Hi, mate. Yes, I am.
Hello. You've had a bit of a trim.
I was 5 minutes late because I was so busy trimming my beard. Yeah, I put on a couple of kilos of hair during lockdown, but I've tried to take a couple of them off.
So your comment there about the conventional view that crises suit incumbents.
Yeah, I just thought it was interesting that very striking chart you had of the 70-28 or whatever it was on is this not the time to try new ideas, or is this the time to not go back to the old economy? Like that struck me as a pretty sharp way to put the argument for not changing, to be honest. It feels like the kind of thing that people would say, and quite a small number of people said it. And I wonder whether the inflection point comes, like a COVID crisis is presumably good for an incumbent, but when it stops being a COVID crisis and becomes an economic crisis, if it's incumbent policy that is essentially unchanged, and it feels like tax, infrastructure and IR is very cherished to the government. They obviously do genuinely think it'll work, but jeepers, you couldn't call it fresh.
No, you definitely couldn't call it fresh. And yeah, that sort of distinction that Michael makes is important. It's sort of like when in the psychology of the country do we stop being in a COVID crisis, in a pandemic, and then when are we just in a bloody, horrendous downturn? When does that happen? And I don't know. I don't know when that happens. I suppose the longer it goes on is when it happens.
And households haven't really felt the income crunch yet either, because like the jobs have happened, but people have still been largely being paid, and super has just sloshed money into bank accounts. So there's this moment we're in this weird scenario where unemployment's really high, but that is ahead of the curve where it would normally be. Usually by this stage it'd be way worse in the sort of the spending
in the real world.
So that is still around the corner.
No, agreed. Yeah. So
go on, you go, Katharine.
No. I was just going to say, that's all right. We are in this weird. It's hard to describe it really. Why we are in this sort of delayed, real-time reaction to events. It'd be partly because the government's, sort of cushioned events, yes, I suppose when things become less cushioned, how do people respond?
Isn't that where this budget is really, really important? Like, it has got to work for the government to go the distance. If we say that because of the government intervention using traditional, call it Keynesian, call it intervention, people haven't suffered through this black swan event, over the next 12 months, if that is wound back and the pump priming and the trickle down that they're trying doesn't work, then the world's very different in lived experience for people, but also in that sense that we can blame the black swan. The black swan just becomes another bird on the pond, and we have a real economic recession/depression happening. That is and no matter how much incentives you give a small business to hire another trainee or buy a new photocopier, they ain't doing it because they're trying to work out how to get through to the next paycheck.
Exactly.
It's a very different world, isn't it?
No, well, it is. And that's the point I was trying to make, obviously, like really not very articulately, is that there's that sort of, there's your short-term anxiety point, Peter, which is why do people invest when they're worried, right? Businesses, why do they buy the photocopier? Why do they employ the apprentice, particularly if the wage subsidy runs out in 6 months? I mean, why do you do it, right, when you're worried about everything? But at the national level, at the level of 70-odd% of people saying, I'm not quite sure that the old economic rules work anymore, that's when that rubber starts to hit the road, I think, to the extent that it's sort of like you can't keep bowling up the same responses that have been orthodox economics for decades if they are demonstrably not working. And the reason why the debate here about that stuff is more muted than it is in America and Europe is because we didn't have a recession after the GFC, whereas people in America and Europe have been through a major recession in recent memory, and that was followed by orthodox macroeconomic policy responses that didn't have the result that they have had in other periods. So at a certain point in time, you know, people will get that the economic responses that we've all thought were the right ones for several decades may not actually be the ones that are most effective for where the economy is now and where, anyway, I'm not being very articulate, but that's what I mean.
No, I think you've nailed it. I'm just going to jump back into a couple more slides. We asked some special Queensland questions. I'm going to actually just give John a prompt that I am going to ask him if in a sec whether we actually ask a voting intention or if we've kept that gun in our holster. But the polls have been a little bit too paced on Queensland to date. Katharine, I know a lot of the word out of Queensland is it's really tight or Labor's behind. There was a poll with Labor ahead today. Poll schmoles. The context of it, though, is, of course, that the Premier's pretty popular, opposition leader less so. And if you line up as a sort of straight, old-style sort of beauty contest, you know, she's in quite a good state. That said, Queensland's a funny old place and there are a whole lot of different issues running in different parts of the state. But I don't know if you've been looking at Queensland in any depth and whether you've got anything you'd like to add on that.
No, I haven't. Look, I haven't followed it closely. I followed it very superficially and from my post a long, long way away. You would think setting aside the caveat that Queensland is Queensland, which we can return to in a tick, you would think the Premier's sort of competent management of COVID would be the major issue on the ballot in this contest, because it's sort of the major issue would be the major issue on the ballot in any contest at the moment because people are so preoccupied by it. But Queensland is Queensland, my God. Like, you know, that state has massive sort of bull runs one way or the other. So you'd need to, and it's such a huge state. It's sort of several states within a state. So, anyway, it'd be interesting to see, though, how that all comes together. Did she launch the campaign today?
I believe so.
Did I see that in the distance? Yeah.
Yeah, I believe so. One other slide we had on Queensland. I don't know how much it tells me. Cost of living, jobs, maybe a little bit surprised cost of living is so high but I think it also speaks to the fact that what we often forget is that many of the lowest income seats in Australia are in Queensland, and particularly out of the metro area, there are real pockets that are struggling, and you would imagine would feel the first wave of economic downturn, and particularly those areas that have been reliant on tourism previously. I know there's lots of talk going on up there about what is the Queensland economic response. It seems to be coalescing around pump priming the mining industry again, given that that's the one sector that sort of tends to create large-scale jobs there. But probably not, if you look at that sort of setup, it's not totally being fought where the government would want it to be fought.
Yeah.
Have we got any 2PP on that stuff, or are we keeping that tight, John? It might.
So we haven't got any 2PP as such. We do have a look at the primary vote there, and in a typical week when we speak to about 200 people or so from Queensland, over the past few months the coalition has seen a lead in that primary vote, and that looks like it's starting to narrow slightly in the past couple of waves, so this week and the fortnights previously.
Interesting. So she's got about 4 weeks, I think, to sort of nail down the colours there. I'm just having a look in the chat. There's been a few questions about this whole play on gas. Katharine, I don't know if you'd like to. I know gas is one of your sort of special subjects. Will that play out in the budget this evening, or do you think that's all been?
I think a lot of that's been pre-announced. I think it'd be interesting to look in terms of whatever concessions are offered for business. The oil and gas industry have asked for a number of tax concessions in this budget. It'll be interesting to see if they get any of what they've asked for, because that certainly hasn't been telegraphed in advance. No, I think the bulk of the so-called gas-led recovery was telegraphed ahead of time. So, but yeah, I just think the tax concessions keep eyes out for.
Indeed. I'm just going to see if Philip wants to come on camera. Otherwise, I will read his question. I'm trying to unmute him as we think. G'day, Philip. Are you there?
Peter, yes, I am. Thanks for this. Peter, it was just a question. The small business self-employed sector is about 13% of the workforce now. It's down from 17% almost 20 years ago. But that small business sector of self-employed people is more white collar than blue collar, and their need for equipment is markedly down, I suggest, because you have a computer and a phone, you can run your business from almost anywhere. And so therefore I'm wondering, Katharine, whether really the government can do much more to stimulate you to spend. In other words, you've got your phone, you've got your computer, it doesn't matter if it's 6 months, 12 months, or 3 years old, you can still run your self-employed small business from wherever without needing to spend more money. So you don't pay in tax.
Yeah, well, that's right. There's sort of speculation around about special measures for small business. I don't know exactly what, but we'll all know within a few hours. But it's sort of an interesting point you raise. Obviously, a lot of small businesses and large businesses in Australia are sort of services oriented. The economy is services oriented. It's sort of and obviously services have been hit very hard in the pandemic, right, across the board. So we've seen the government sort of, with both the gas-led recovery, which Peter's right, it is a trigger word for me, but anyway, I'll breathe through it, and with the manufacturing incentives that the government flagged a week or so ago. There is this sort of hankering towards, sort of non-services business, if that's even a term, right? But to what extent that can be the reality. If you look at the manufacturing money, for example, it's not very much. It's like 1.5 billion over 10 years or something. Not a lot of money. And we're sort of back to picking winners being fashionable at the government level again. In the sense of, pick areas of strategic interest and invest money in them, so I don't know. It seems to me to be sort of strange when you sort of line it up against where the economy currently is. But, obviously the pandemic, the flip side of that is the pandemic has kind of revealed weaknesses in supply chains, in strategic areas of manufacturing. It's reasonable for the government to have a look at those. So, I mean, that's a bit of a long-winded kind of response, but it's just sort of pulling together different threads, I suppose, of the arguments around business at the moment. And we're a bit disadvantaged because I suspect there's more for business tonight, but I don't know exactly what it is.
Thanks, Katharine. Kit had a question about the colour of the budget. You there, Kit?
Yeah. Hey, I was picking up on stuff I read this morning about Boris Johnson announcing at the Tory party conference their big spend on offshore wind and how the UK Conservative government is pushing for a green recovery and why our Conservative government is pushing for a gas recovery. It's an interesting contrast yet again, isn't it?
Yes, and a depressing one that somehow, well, we can thank Margaret Thatcher for closing the coal mines, right? It sort of has made it easier for Britain not to completely, or British Conservatives not to lose their mind over climate change in the same way that the Liberal and National parties have lost their mind over climate change for the best part of a decade. I have no words, honestly. What can you say about it? But here we are, still all hoping for sanity. I suppose like the plus side of the gas-led recovery, sort of think I've said this before, is that it might be 2/5 of bugger all. There's a sort of maximalist version of the gas-led recovery that's deeply scary and deeply against Australia's interests and the interests of it's just completely, it's completely opposed to climate science. So that's a bit of a problem. But sort of in the days I'm inclined to be optimistic, I think to myself, well, Scott Morrison's got the Liberal and National parties out of the coal cul-de-sac where they were lodged, very firmly over the last sort of decade or so. There's a midpoint, which is gas. Maybe the gas transition leads us towards renewables, perhaps on the minimalist version of the gas-led recovery. But, we've got to wait and see. And unfortunately, as I keep telling various people in the government when they are cranky with me for launching yet another Katusha about how stupid they are, I say, well, at this point in time, I judge you on your record, folks. And when you give me another record to judge, I'll judge you on that. But right now, you are accountable for your wrecking, insane, stupid behaviour that you have lobbed at the Australian public for the last 10 years. So when you start not being that, I'll write nice things. Don't know if that's an answer to the question, but that's what I've got.
Now, I'm not sure if my connection's become unstable or yours, Katharine, but one final question, another colour to throw at you, pink. Is it valid to look at this budget through a gender frame?
The pink recession. Oh my God, I hate that. I really do hate it.
But the idea that this is a blokes-led economic plan that's being put forward here, is that valid?
I was going to track myself back to the facts rather than just objecting to terminology. Yes, it is valid. It is valid. Some of the employment numbers that Frydenberg, or the Treasurer, sort of briefed to us in over the last couple of days about the pickup, like women were obviously completely destroyed in terms of women's employment was very, very badly impacted by this, by the pandemic. But in the recovery, women are coming back slightly more strongly than the government thought they would in terms of, re-engagement with the labour market. So ticks for that. But in terms of, is there a pink recession? Well, much and all as I hate the terminology, there's a bunch of valid questions to ask about, whether encouraging female participation in the labour market is a growth strategy. Obviously, the answer to that question, just factually, is yes. And that then gets back to the sort of conundrum we were talking about before, Peter, which is whether giving people a tax cut and a business concession to hire someone is as good a strategy as investing in, I don't know, more direct employment for aged care or employment for childcare or whatever else. So yeah, I mean, long-winded answer that says yes, this is a valid issue, even if I don't like the words pink recession. I don't know why I don't like them, I just don't.
Yeah, it kind of feels a bit reductionist, and I've always thought that, and I've written about this in the past, that we need to look at this as a class issue, not a gender issue anyway, around the way that we value caring in our economy. Hey, on that note, that sort of winds us down to the hour. I think if we've agreed on anything, this is actually really consequential, what comes out tonight, and it begins the pathway back to accountability. I know that you will be right at the front end holding the government accountable. We really look forward to reading your analysis this evening and then into the early hours, I'm sure, of tomorrow morning, Katharine. But thanks for spending time on what's a really full-on day for you. Like, I know it would have been fine for you to tap out today, but I know the audience really appreciates the ongoing access to your brain, as do I. So thanks a lot. For those that are regulars, we've actually got Jimmy Barnes in conversation with Andrew Stafford on Friday as part of the Guardian Book Club. So please come back on Friday. We'll send you out an invite over the next couple of days. But yeah, back to the budget and back to the madness of the rest of the world. And thanks everyone. Stay safe, and yeah, all the best on the work to come over the rest of the day, Katharine. See you, everybody. Cheers.
See ya. Bye, guys.